Hello everyone, today we talk about the Hellenic and Hellenistic, broadly meant, part of the Roman Empire during the 2nd century AD, the eastern world of the Roman Empire to be even more comprehensive. I made a couple of years ago some videos from a series that I plan to resume at some point about the Roman provinces. I think the last interrupted project was about Roman Asia. And we already observed, for example, in the videos about Pontus and Bithynia, as well as Egypt, that we also discussed more recently, some characteristics that are not just proper to the period, but can be traced back or even further ahead in time. As a medievalist discussing this topic is quite important and interesting. I always tell the history of the Roman Empire in that sort of traditionally hierarchical and organical sense that has been largely lost, like the idea of Rome as a great feudal empire, we can so say, that naturally clashes against sort of the views that we had of the empire throughout most of historiography. The plurality and difference of the various subjected and living under Rome was the same sap of the Roman hegemony, inasmuch as these communities had recognized the superiority of their overlords and contributed to maintain that cosmic order that paved the way, in fact, to a Catholic understanding of the world, far beyond what some groups had only been exposed recently to, or at least had maintained and understood from a smaller scale perspective. Within this world, of course, there is a lot that today we're not going to discuss per se, but I was pointing out the medieval aspect of this because, as you know, in our videos about Byzantine history, we often point out the fact that there is an extraordinary continuity of Hellenic civilization, culture, and general communitary models across the millennia, literally. This is a famous topic, right? While Rome exploded, literally, from a pretty warlike, primitive background in the span of a few centuries, right, to take over the world, Greece had established, since the Dorian migration especially, but also with some chthonic continuities as a basis of this, a bit in the same way Rome, as we were saying now, was spiritually and morally hegemonic in the various spheres that she came to dominate, and continued, like speaking about Hellenic civilization, also made a video about the rise and fall in the Indo-European perspective, maintained its fundamentals politically, socially, etc. throughout, you can argue, the entire, up to the Ottoman conquest, fundamentally, with some further continuity in that as well, but not as the cornerstone of an autonomous civilization anymore. The foundations are the city, the coastal dimension, the fact that basically the Greek mindset would not see anything outside of this model of Hellenic perfection, so much so that in this point, in which we will see now the Hellenistic world was also playing a very important role within the empire, it still didn't picture, at least, the fact that, of course, they were under somebody else. They thought to be living fully, again, in that traditional organic perspective, in their own perfect Hellenic world, right? And we're talking not just an Hellenic, as we were saying in the beginning, but an Hellenistic reality as well, which is a bit more complicated to discuss for the simple reason that, we can say, even in contrast to the West and the East, talking the Roman Empire here in general, of course, Hellenism went beyond that, but especially in the East. But let's say that Hellenism often appears, this East often appears as at least to some, I don't subscribe to that, but at least as far as the Hellenistic fundamentals are, because those were the dominating one, a sort of more uniform system of sort, culturally, think about just the Hellenic koine and say how this had objectively informed since Alexandrian time the face of an enormous amount of territories straddling 3 continents. The perception of a uniformity is, however, misleading as much as thinking the Roman Empire and any other system of the time or any traditional time in history as, in fact, this essentially 19th century nation-state idea that what you see as a single color on the map is just a unique thing. I discovered, the more I go on, also as a medievalist, that one of the most difficult things to make people picture, or at least I don't struggle much with that, but I take the chance of pointing it out for all the times I read it, also not just on Schwerpunkt, out there, like expressed by others, is essentially the deterministic, the materialistic understanding of polities, as if the existence of a specific governmental form or an official polity would simply equate to the absolute substance of that reality, and or could simply picture the moral force that was creating the same. I will not digress now in historical political philosophy. However, the notion that fundamentally a power is to be measured on the decisive moral support of those who contribute to it rather than on any other sort of formalistic, rigid, categorical, and at the end of the day, deeply anti-traditional. And when talking to people who are habituated to that convention, it's very difficult to express, right? If I say so, it may sound like, for example, a sort of leftistic, anti-nationalistic statement. It's quite the contrary, because that nationalistic statement is in itself leftistic, the product of just a couple of 100 years, and it doesn't absolutely mean, by criticizing that, in fact, there weren't people, races, cultures that were dominating over others, and that actually continue far beyond those few 100 years which people mostly think that countries or peoples were made. And in fact, it expresses the deepest metaphysical essence of superiority and inferiority of peoples. That instead is the concept that a fourth estate, in fact, nationalistic and or socialistic system, like the one in which people fundamentally think to live because they've been surgically indoctrinated to believe, like by their, say, conventional basic education, if we can even so call it, of a post-traditional past, that there could be a standard that supersedes, surpasses the essentially the lesser people's fourth estate delusion that people are normal and good and capable, intelligent and brave and attractive and whatever. They are, right? And they aren't in the measure in which they do not own power, and this power is relatively insignificant to, in fact, world domination. So of all the forces that agitate themselves, it can be even a matter of absolute power. People have more in a material sense, but that's also an illusion, because at the end of the day, even though that power exists, can be wielded, it's not, say, properly introduced to be wielded in terms of power in its metaphysical potential. Is to say, what we have now, we do not make the most of in the way a person just even living 100 years ago would have done. It's a matter of moral force, all right? Even beyond, or at least, going in parallel with the spiritual dimension. So again, I'm not going to discuss this, but when talking about Hellenism, it's important to realize what this had been, because Rome had basically come to rule over a system that had come to rule over other systems, and that was not disbanded when Rome took over at all, which is one of the most exemplificative pictures of the aforementioned statement. Essentially, Rome included, universally, of course, any other people on earth, and the same Alexandrian achievement that kept being superior to the various peoples that had been conquered by the Megas. And so You have an Hellenic at this point rather than Hellenistic core, which is not, as you know, just Hellas per se, but any kind of polis that exists out there that managed to establish a control, even through further colonization that was most typically Macedonian, like in properly in its Alexandrian aspect, and that's why, in fact, Hellenistic is a bit of a complex thing. You can't even say precisely where Hellenism ends, even in Roman times, even when there are other peoples ruling, like, I don't know, the Arsacids at this point in Iran. Those were other places that had where Hellenism kept living, even in the military traditions, etc. Telling the history of 2nd century AD Hellenistic world within the Roman Empire, which is not just Hellenistic, as we'll understand now as well, is, however, the history of such stratification. Remember, Rome stands out, is inherently superior. Roman citizens are the upper class of this race of rulers. Then you have different, and in fact unequal levels, just like the foedera iniqua. We'll talk about them at some point, but you know what I'm talking about if you're familiar with Roman history. That's how properly Latin explained that powerfully, right? When you think about so-called equality, remember the Roman concept of citizenship, and do not think it, in fact, in that liberal, throwaway fashion that, I don't know, Mary Beard made essentially an entire living, stopping, in fact, to the 3rd century AD, and just sort of pushing that narrative that I don't think is very useful. But that also comes for a specific historical, cultural, political background. I'm not going to make any particular criticism about that. I've never really, thought to get into this kind of broader criticism for my videos yet, in a serious, say, enacting fashion. I prefer to talk my own way. At times, however, you must address these topics because, as we were saying, like, there is a stratification of peoples that are all different from one another, and that in fact occupy a different place in this great universal hierarchy that the empire at the end of the day really is, right? Was the West more uniform than the East in this? As I said before, the Hellenistic presence was more punctiform, but at the same time interconnected in a sort of more uniform way, right? Meaning that Hellenic and Hellenistic culture in its immensity was fundamentally cohesive, was fundamentally unitary, right? If anything, there is a single language, there is a single sort of at least heavily influential Hellenic matrix to that. The West was a different thing, right? It worked not by points, it worked by massive regional ethnic molding. That's how the Romans literally made Italic Spain go. Other parts that eventually were Germanized, like Britain. Of course, it's not like these people completely lost their language, but at large, right, during the empire, they became Romance, right? And also along the Danube, for example, just for saying how the East that we're looking at is composite. I made this point in other videos as well. You would think that, I don't know, the Balkans, the East up to the Danube, more or less, the bigger culture was close at hand, was the Hellenic one, right, the Hellenistic one. Actually, between the Balkans and the Danube, the language, as also today's Romanian through different circles proves, was Romance. You find it in Serbian, in Croatian, lots of languages bear a very heavy mark of Latin, regardless of the fact, and of course because of Roman colonization, that interestingly enough wasn't in fact, as you know, that intense in the East at all. The Romans made that simple choice. We talked this recently also in the video about the gladiatorial Munera, observing that essentially this is a Western phenomenon. It didn't happen in the East. The Greeks at some point did copy the Romans in that, but there are a few amphitheaters, if any, and the reason in part for the let's say this divide is not just the fact that, of course, cultures are different, difficult to mold, especially when they are very old, like the Hellenic one. as opposed to more sort of tribal systems that had not even just developed a certain level of cultural cohesiveness, aside from what people like to think about the Celts treating them again as a 19th century, national statalistic identity of some sort, uniform, homogeneous. These were mostly ethnographic inventions of the Helleno-Roman perception, aside from, of course, certain specific regional contexts that were more cohesive. The truly Gallic, say, feeling was mostly something shared between Gaul and Britain at large. Regardless, yes, there were the Galatide, there were other peoples that, of course, were in that sense Celtic, but one must understand what it meant for them, first and foremost, what kind of identities were more prevalent, and why. Because those names were not random at all, and they could tell you much. But the point is that the Hellenistic world was more governable, and part of the reason why it was more governable is that the peoples that Alexander had conquered, in a sense, were first of all more habituated to be ruled upon by kings of kings, pharaohs, et similia, and in that sense were also relatively spent peoples that had gone through a sort of cycle that wouldn't quite bring them ever again fundamentally back on track as an autonomous or primigenial, at least, civilization on their own, right? Even what we see, I don't know, in the Islamic period at large, aside from the fact that they literally began to speak Arab, far and wide, especially in the establishment and so on, is that, I don't know, even the Abbasid Caliphate was a heavy product of Romano-Persian, and also in their Hellenistic legacy. So you understand how far and wide we can go. But if you start reasoning on these levels, right, everything becomes simpler, right? Because you don't have to confine yourself, breaking your head on sort of cheap, simplified, and for that reason superficial and unsatisfactory categorizations, whatever you want to say. When did the empire end? All those kind of useless questions that people still pose, because they think they can get a definitive answer and they can go around claiming some sort of historical wisdom of some sort. That's not how we make history, in case you didn't notice. Besides, another very deep important difference with the West is that regardless of that aforementioned lack of a more cohesively political identitary capacity, from a strictly ethnic point of view, which is another level that is also very and primarily important in understanding, as we were saying before, with the Celts, for example, like the fact that they understood themselves or Celts or not is not as important as their actual ethno cultural, linguistical background, right? And in that sense, in fact, when you look at the West, you realize that in spite of that political fragmentation, it was much more homogeneous. And Romanity did contribute to that as well by reinforcing, in fact, the regional identities as well. I mean, at large, the Celto-Iberian world remained that, like Gaul remained that, like these countries were reinforced, and even though they were heavily Romanized, they did still maintain like a national capacity and autonomy that would emerge more clearly, in fact, in the later empire, also considering, as we will see now, that in fact the roots of civilization, that establishment, were much newer, much more recent in the West compared to the East, that had gone on for millennia. And civilization in the West fundamentally starts with the Romans. Not even that late as we think. At least Italy maintains this role of cornerstone of civilization. If you look at the spread of literacy in Europe, just per se, you realize that the Greeks actually remained there. But you may, of course, understand how relevant they are for our world in terms of our own legacy, especially of thought, of scientific view, and much else. But Hellenic culture, as we were saying before, remained inwardly looking. it remained close within itself. It's not like the people inhabiting 10 kilometers away from the Hellenic colonies scattered across the Mediterranean became Greek, right? Instead, the West became largely and ethnically Romano-Italic in formal definition, Romance, if you prefer. So it's a completely different picture. The various peoples that lived within the this Hellenistic world, if you want this broader Levantine dimension, if you look at, say, also the boundaries of the Roman Empire in the East, were much more fragmented, right? In particular ways. There was, of course, a substantial, I don't know, you can look at it more Syrian, a more Egyptian, a more, and there it becomes complicated because these are a few, the best outlineable identities. But also when you start getting into Asia Minor, you understand it's very composite. And also because there is a lot of interland that is not, historically has been really invaded by many different peoples. And even though it has a specific base, it's very mixed. This is what you don't really find in the West. I mean, the Italic background, the Gallic background, the Germanic background, the Brittonic background, the Celtiberian background, more or less are that, right? And or they change in a uniform way. In part they get Romanized, in part they get Germanized, but they are fundamentally homogeneous. The East, in that, may have also, of course, displayed heavy traits of, in fact, equally heavy ethnic continuity. But these were not mirrored by a further political individualism or autonomization, right? Also, the later emperors from the East at that point, like, they did come from different communities that definitely were important politically and strategically in this context. But you never see, for example, a Syrian country as a wall that operates in that context. Not even the Palmyrene Empire is fundamentally that. Not even, even Egypt, that is much more geographically straightforward. With the Nile Valley that is just in the midst of the desert, you have just those boundaries and that's it. They do not resume some kind of protagonistic role eventually, right? Differently from, again, other parts of the Roman Empire, especially in the West. This may be actually true also for the Balkans, for places that had objectively not been, also the Pannonian, in general, like frontier, that had not been heavily Romanized, right? It's this is yet another delicate picture. We talk about peoples like the Skordisky, the Boy, etc., and you do realize that the proximity to the steppes, also just the Central Eastern European world, not talking about the North, was much sort of more exposed, fragile. It prompted, in fact, the locals to at some point even move away and to literally found a national identity elsewhere during the migration era, whereas those peoples living in the places that what these groups had left from fundamentally maintained much smaller kind of provincial identities at most. We're not talking about the disproportion in population and so how important the bigger systems later on really were in southwestern Europe. These, as you know, we've seen very often in the Middle Ages, would maintain more or less that Hellenistic outlook within the Byzantine Empire, with those essentially at some point xenophobic, urban-based, but urban-limited, I would say, because also the West was urban-based, but in a completely different way from the Hellenic way, and a coastal dimension especially. Rome in the West instead really molds, again, the interland, the majority of the people at large, and also providing it with an incredibly more prosper and sound and base and structured system in the Middle Ages. Regardless of the difficulties there too, of the fact that, again, those peoples had come to civilization later, the North exists there too. Okay, there is the Atlantic the Gulf current, let's say, that helps a little bit compared to other places in the East and Central, Northern Europe. However, we do find this paradox in the Middle Ages that I continuously stress, telling the truth, that Western civilization in Latin Germanic world survived in a shocking way, considering these prodromes. The fact that this was a relatively young system that overly performed. I say Latin Germanic, we could add here, considering this was the same Celtic one, right? So, going to the 2nd century AD, the East saw significant prosperity in this period, similarly to the West. This is basically what is conventionally understood as the moment of peak of the Roman Empire, especially under Trajan. The Antonines, for different reasons, respectively, say military power, say territorial extension and living conditions, general stability of a system that tends, in fact, to be a bit more grounded and permanent. That will, however, also tend towards the crisis later, but not without having left those aforementioned foundations that would not really leave, even when the Roman Empire was formally, at least in that legalistic, Byzantinistic sense of how that also people indulge into today, like when did the Roman Empire end, sort of gone. That's not where the Roman Empire ends, or what the Roman Imperium was properly meant by any of the peoples living in the 2nd century, for that matter. Nevertheless, the perceived balance between the two sections of the empire during the mid-century masks a deeper dynamic that is anything but equal, in fact, between the two systems. This is a moment, again, of generalized prosperity, and so it seems like everything works pretty well everywhere, but again, there are different rhythms, different gears, different paths that highlight the historical difference. It was already there before the Romans and would remain after the Romans between the East and the West. And that, in fact, the Roman Empire had not even begun or wanted or pretended to change at any point. You can actually say that at this point, the Western provinces had reached their zenith. Right? The Romans had conquered these places. They had this enormous background from which they sprang out of the Italian peninsula with this completely different vision of the world, at least a revived one that had been almost lost to the ages. I made multiple videos on this for our sort of traditional and religious history series, so I don't need to repeat myself on this. There was, of course, again, a principle of hierarchy involved. The Romans are, in this sense, often misunderstood because from one side it's important to stress their primitivity, but at the same time we're looking at an exception that we don't see anywhere really in the Mediterranean or in Europe. As we said before, Hellenic culture remained confined more or less to the coastland. The same can be said for the Phoenicians. So there are these other peoples in the interland, but they're mostly not civilized. When you look at Romano-Italic history, you realize that this system, without being conquered by anyone, without being colonized by anyone, and again also I repeat it, the Hellenic colonization does that much, right? And was not really the engine behind the rise of Rome and her conquest of the Italic peoples, and their, in fact, springing out in this rapaciously successful fashion, was an actually civilized country. Again, in terms of, you have the Etruscans, for example, they're a great civilization, but even they're crossing them out simply, or carving them out actually from the Italian system, from the one that was really the backbone, like this Villanovian plus Indo-European grafting that had produced that Apenninic culture from which, again, Rome, especially Indo-Europeans, but in that sense also the Etruscans, like there is been too much rigid separation there in terms of actual origin, really emerged from it. These are quite civilized quite early on, right? If you look at, again, there was one of the few beautiful videos that I ever watched on YouTube that was about the spread of literacy in the world, and you realize that even though certain civilizations quite early on began to write, like we're talking thousands of years before say Europe rose to fundamental preeminence in the system, this literacy is mostly concentrated in large demic pools with enough surplus to establish statehood and so on in the great riverways of the world, right? So all the great civilizations of India, China, Mesopotamia, Egypt. What happens in Italy is the only country that basically witnesses the development of writing as just an indicator of a civilizational development, of course through the input of other cultures, but let's say in a uniform way for the peninsula itself that could be, let's say, that was not unified by a single river valley, or was very rich and populated, that is true, but that in this sense starts taking over Western Central Europe by itself, right, and fundamentally civilizes it, and throughout also after the Roman Empire, with Rome at the center from a cultural, spiritual, and in a sense still political point of view. Think about Charlemagne and the papacy. Would continue doing so, would continue civilize, pouring out this enormous amount of culture, of acculturation, right, of civilization, of power. This is the picture you've not been told. This is just, again, there was a red blob that was the Roman Empire. Before, there were kind of other peoples that weren't as cool as the Romans yet, and not even the same Romans before they were cool. And then after that, everything collapsed, and there was just the barbarians in the Dark Ages, and Constantinople was the only cool thing because, again, it's a purple blob on the map that you look on history books. This is a completely ridiculous, other than just anachronistic and objectively dumb view of history that the more time passes, the more I simply think it doesn't make any sense to even think to protect or to safeguard. What is, again, crazy is that this view is relatively recent, right? It's not really something that was understood, as we were saying before the emergence of the nation state a couple of 100 years ago, right? Everybody had, for example, a mad respect towards Rome before that. Today, it's just, you mimified that in that sense of statalistic, nationalistic nonsense, even when, in fact, the peoples out there were not even formed in opposition against Rome in that fashion. And you don't see how they got Romanized entirely in the process, as Europe has fundamentally been all across. I mean, Latin was the formal, official language of Europe for millennia. So what the hell are we even talking about, right? There was a zenith reached because, of course, also the Romano-Italic background could do so much just in the control over the entire empire. Right? The Roman Empire was fundamentally not a shared system of citizenship that, in fact, collapsed in the moment in which reached that peak, or at least began to fade away, to exhaust itself, to re-edit itself in different ways that was seemed like post-Roman, but that were just like in the fading of an overarching spiritual hegemony rather than in the actual end of Romanity that, in fact, was resumed, as also by the Germans in a metaphysical, ethnic sense for the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, that still entailed that Latin Germanic background, that essentially Western dominion. And I don't know, very underappreciated thing, as I was saying before, was the centrality of Italy all throughout. We made multiple videos showing how the sense of decline, in the way it was historically perceived, also in the centrality of the Italian peninsula, etc., was always relative in many ways. I mean, the region was always very advanced, and its sort of political centrality is often just put aside when you see that there were nominal emperors ruling from one part of the empire, for example, deciding, in fact, to go over to Constantinople, or having their comitatus in other parts along the Rhine or the Danube. Surely there were more important cities in a administrative sense, in a strategic sense, but that's not what the empire was fundamentally about. That's also why Rome always remained the capital. But as we've seen also in unexpectedly, at least for conventional popular opinion, like even in the early Middle Ages, in, I don't know, the time of the Longobards, Italy remained uninterruptedly the, for example, richest per capita country in the world until the late 17th century. And still today, the Italian per capita wealth is actually higher than the German or the Swedish one. And it seems to me that we live in a world in which we do not picture what this actually means or why. I'm ever more shocked by people's ignorance at times, but I understand that there is a fabrication behind this, that there is some sort of narrative and agenda that wanted properly to distract from this aspect. That Roman-Italic legacy was, again, incredibly permeating. If you think about the paths, the axis, let's say, of medieval civilization, medieval European civilization development, they do drastically follow the Romanization boundaries, right? There is no doubt whatsoever in any continuation of political, military, and social relevance all across the West. We will talk again on this. I understand that you like tendentially these topics, so I'm not making one that say we shouldn't sort of approach them, but sometimes they are better approached from topics like these, I think, that are, instrumental to it rather than being just documentary for the period. Naturally, during the 3rd century, we do see the West beginning to falter a little, beginning to shrink, beginning to be tendentially less relevant than the eastern part. Tendentially so, because it's still a unitary empire, it risks to collapse. But also, in there, we tend perhaps to... It's not like the risk did not exist, but let's say, what alternative would have there been? Like, why would, aside from any what-if that is not what happened historically, why would what happened happen? With the restoration of the world by Aurelianus, and just it could have been someone else, frankly. If one wants to be picky, you can look at different contexts. For example, the province of Africa, that is roughly today's Tunisia, did pretty well, also in the later centuries. In comparison, it had an important leverage because of the grain exports to Italy as well. The eastern provinces, however, the Levant, were maintaining at least a greater stability, right? It's not even that they were necessarily more advanced at a certain level or another. It's all very debatable to some extent. And this is even more evident the more the system goes on, because especially when sort of that Byzantine world kicks in with the foundation of Constantinople and that tendentially centralizing direction that would bring, in fact, to a great decline in urban capacity in the East. Let's stress this, because people also have this catastrophistic idea of the collapse of the cities, for example, in the West compared to the East. That's the question. That doesn't seem to have been the case at all, right? The Middle Ages actually show this, and it's not like, in fact, there hadn't been great civilizations in the early Middle Ages, like the Byzantine or the Islamic one, on the basis of these previous millenary civilizations that inhabited the Levant, the Middle East. So, tendentially, there is something changing, because the cliche again. The East was richer and more florid and survived, and that's why the Byzantine Empire continued, is still following the legalistic, statalistic path. It's not really looking at what was keeping together those peoples. I recently made, for example, a video about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons that I think that clarifies a big deal of that sense of Roman Catholic continuation of power and spiritual hegemony in the West, in ways that Constantinople could not achieve. In fact, so much so that in those very generations, the Levant was being lost to the Muslims. In any case, it's not like in the 2nd century the East was faring too well too, because there is also this divide between the coastlines that were historically rich, florid. I mean, Hellenism had really blossomed there, surely on the basis of previous civilizations, and then there is an interland, which can be the far eastern Armenian frontier. It's quite militarized and quite rough. The terrain is horrendous, but also much closer places like, for example, what became Isauria, that is very close in as the crow flies to civilization, but remains a bit like Illyricum in the West, actually in the East, because it was technically part of the West, but it was eventually absorbed by the East historically during migration here, isolated and warlike and so on. But it's also different. For example, like Illyricum in that sense was much more civilized than Isauria in many ways. And so in fact, when you look at this Levantine interland, you realize that it wasn't that dramatically stable. On the contrary, for example, steppes people's incursions had been always a thing since Scythian times, the Bronze Age. The West, the Middle East had been fundamentally ravaged by nomadic warriors. It did destructure a bit the system. You do not find, in fact, comparatively, look at the civil system of Rome, what it means to create a statal system that is, however, based on the principle of egalitarian, say, nobility pertaining to the warrior, right, of the Roman people, and setting there a standard of civilization, of legality, etc. That still lives essentially in the roots of in the actual expression of our own Western state. That is also the one that literally took over the world, even beyond direct conquest. Because basically there is no other system in the world today that is not a Western one in the roots of its statal basis. And it is not a Roman one, in fact. The East is not like this. There isn't this level of equality measured in that sense, at least, as the equality of a genus, of a people that is a people in arms that is equal in that sense because it is in act, not in potential or ideally, or just by some abstract right. And in fact, again, the moment in which it's fully extended declines in any relevance. The East at large is fundamentally an autocratic, monarchic system. There are courts, there are kings. The average person is worthless, right? It's not like, again, in the West, the average person was particularly rich or influent. Also, we have this idea of the Roman world as just a world of cities. The overwhelming majority of the population, as always, in any pre-industrial system, lived in the countryside. And at large, even as free peasants, they didn't count too much. But again, as we said before, for Italy itself, even the average Italian peasant was richer than the one of any other part of the world for millennia to come. So the question is particularly relevant concerning the actual quality of this Eastern system, how it was run, and whether its political and institutional qualities were that really relevant. And we will see now there are very positive aspects of the same, but that are different from province to province. There is no doubt that the East managed to sustain its economic achievements longer, and hence their, for example, intellectual contribution eventually emerged as thriving heart of the empire in the subsequent century, more than the West was, at least in that capacity of really holding as a more solidly unified or governable system. This is also the great difference. And remember what I said at the beginning regarding peoples choosing to join that. It's not like the Roman Empire was kept together because behind every person was a Roman legionnaire ready to fix his pilum in your skull. The Roman Empire was kept together because it was overwhelmingly advantageous for the decisive moral majority of all the peoples that remained under it, as in any other reality in history, right? And this was also a pretty successful one. There are realities in history that, of course, maintain the regimes, but they are human sewage. This was essentially the most advanced civilization in the world, together with essentially Han China at this point. And even in that case, we often took a sort of a journey into Chinese affairs. We'll keep doing that. And comparatively also to the Roman Empire, you don't have to think that things were so necessarily comparable. China was also much more autocratic, authoritarian system, regardless of its development, of its widespread wealth, and so on. So let's understand what essentially the system is, at least by the end of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd. It can be said to an extent that the overall advancement of the East was happening at the expense of a stagnating West. Right? By the beginning of the 3rd century, the system was unique, entire, but there is a powerful mover there that are the Silk routes that end essentially in Levant, right? As far as also like Mediterranean traffics are concerned. These are of course present in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and there is also actually the Red Sea route, so controlling Egypt is very important. The Romans of course controlled this, but as we explained before, the Roman supremacy was not much a matter of, simple local presence. Before we made the example of the guy treasuring, the Roman army, as you know, at this point was actually pretty small considering the enormity of the empire. So tendentially, wealth would tend to sediment in those places that were just more directly exposed to the most precious sources of income. The West was a bit more sheltered. This did help for the general stabilization, but the East had more fuel coming directly from the East. A bit, right? Again, this is not a deterministic explanation. This is not what would, in hindsight, would save the East, even under a strictly Roman control side of the story later on. Nevertheless, we're talking prior times. The West was paradoxically experiencing a golden age of sort. This was particularly evident in the latter part of the Antonine period, or at least a bit before the plague, where you have this notion that essentially the best time to be a Roman ever would have been under the reign of Marcus Aurelius, just in terms of quality of life, which, as we know, may occur when a civilization has started to slightly give way or decline, stagnating. This is in part like all the wealth accumulation, thanks to the fact that Rome, Italy had the upper hand over the entire system. They had created themselves, and so Rome was, even herself as a capital, at her peak. It's a bit like comparatively later, like Constantinian Rome was sort of more munificent than in terms of presence of buildings, for example, continuously built over across the centuries, but it wasn't as florid or important as before at the same time, which is an interesting parallelism, showing you that dualistic interpretation, dichotomies are not really the way to go for anything. In fact, there were factors contributing to the shift towards the East. The eastern regions, as we've seen, had historically been home to ancient and illustrious civilizations that had kept consistently enjoying significant prosperity, as their collective memory, culture, and experiences shaped various aspects of life, including techniques, trade, social systems, politics, economy, spirituality, if you want or must really break them down. Despite this, they faced challenges from piracy, banditry, conquest, civil wars, and subsequent devastation themselves, which weakened and fragmented these areas, prompting a certain retreat as well. In fact, if you look at it still, it's the Romans that have come there to dictate rule. And now, even though many provinces have witnessed an important degree of Romanization, so you see ever more locals that fundamentally start ruling as they had always done, but saying increasing in the rising up to the ranks, the local communities, the stability of the whole system still depends on the Roman military that is controlled from Rome, from the Roman establishment, from essentially a Romano-Italic rule that has dispersed its clans also across Europe, the Mediterranean, and that still has it by itself. Just like, I don't know, the Antonides, like these were families coming from even the provinces by now, but they were, of course, part of the older ruling people rather than, say, class, as you would point out. And it helps very much understanding this. So when you look at the East, yes, it was florid, it was advanced, it was well developed, and with this millenary legacy, but always remember that it was dependent on the West. Hadn't there been a Roman Empire as a whole, like there would have been, of course, another power would have controlled these places, right? And maybe this would have brought to some decline of theirs had, in fact, the center of this power been somewhere else. In part, this was also true for Rome. It's not like Rome was donating the East for charity. Everything was instrumental to maintain that Roman control over the system. However, still, the Roman Empire was so successful that just by sheer authority, charisma, might, was keeping so the surrounding peoples fundamentally at bay. And if you find this kind of brigandage and other issues, it's because the interland was not as productive or interesting or important for the Romans. And especially still at this point, there weren't significant threats to the stability of the empire as a whole. The great confederacies of the migration era did not exist. The Persians were also all, and would remain, in spite of their later enhancements, a minor power compared, especially to Rome in her sort of Mediterranean and European integrity. The annexations and territorial transformations of the 1st century AD, combined with military campaigns along the frontiers and beyond the empire, produced 4 significant outcomes at the dawn of the Antonine era that restored confidence in eastern territories. Right, Rome had literally destroyed the Parthians. That had been one of the greatest accomplishments. Of course, like, you can't go into the Iranian plateau to simply say do not reform as an empire, but tendentially, again, the Roman show-off in Mesopotamia had been quite significant and relevant in exactly to eliminate issues in the Levant. But let's go by order. There was, first of all, a period of internal peace and substantial stability also in the empire, right? And locally, with exceptions such as the Jewish revolts that were not an irrelevant phenomenon. By the way, it was fueled by the Persians, but let's say persistent, albeit limited banditry in regions like Roman Egypt, Thrace, and northeastern Cappadocia. Things were fundamentally fine, right? The dissolution of all client states west of the Euphrates, the last being the kingdom of Nabatea, even annexed in 106 AD, had helped consolidating the frontier, had actually increase the costs of the empire, but these powers, as they had been co-opted by the Romans in order to defend as proxies the frontier being gradually subsumed by the empire itself, were not individually as performing as the Roman military could be. Thus, it was better than just integrating them and using them as new levies and fortifying the eastern front, even though everything was still relatively light in terms of, for example, defensive systems and so on. Trajan has somehow started, Hadrian especially, I guess that's the notion, the affirmation of a more structured limes. So people go back to Domitian, but there had always been some kind of defenses. Now they were gradually increasing. A more transparent and engaged administration, exemplified by the correspondence between Trajan and Pliny. Right, there is a more institutionalized and legalized form of administration. The Romans had arrived in Levant historically just by, ruling, like being bribed by everybody, like not having this still private system where different houses were ruling. In fact, is in a res publica, of an oligarchic establishment that was not the monarchic empire as it would form from the end of the 1st century BC. So all that lightness in administration had been functionally surpassed in its limits. Now it was growing in cost, but it was fundamentally well balanced. There was an economic boost resulting from the presence of troops as well. This may be a secondary and debatable aspect, but the fact that the Roman military was present in the area, it was giving even just, I would say more than else, a sense of security. You realize that did bring to a general capacity of investment attractive business for the same Roman establishment. In Syria, Trajan's campaigns against the Parthians yielded favorable outcomes because rather than being constantly destabilized by his neighbor, you take them out as a stronger power, you basically are more successful. This led to trade relations, even with the same Parthian Empire, resuming with increased intensity and profitability. Again, Rome could not quite take out a people like the Persians, but they could essentially fragment it into many different clans without a unified cohesiveness for a while, especially when you devastated their capital and their Mesopotamian, so tendentially statal bases. So there was no other way but to trade with them. At least it was more favorable, and because the Parthians were this giant pain in the behind between China and Rome that prevented the Silk Route to have sort of just a complete fluidity in the connection between the two empires. There were the Parthians in between, and there was just so much you could do. Another major factor behind the prosperity of the East, let's remember this is also including Hellas, is its extensive urbanization. These places had actually witnessed the birth of urbanization, at least to some extent, especially if you include Mesopotamia there, Egypt. So we're looking at countries that, again, had a pretty solid basis ever since the conquest of Alexander. The Romans, of course, built on it. Right? You're not dumb if you build over what is already been built, which is basically being done by everybody in history. This included even certain roads. Think about how, I don't know, the Achaemenid royal communication system was, you can't say still existing, but in many ways it had been further, developed by the Macedons, by the Romans. So you're looking at a tapestry of centers that remain. This is very important in history. In general, like, never think that countries are that recent. That's another problem of reasoning just with 200-300 years in chronological range back in time. Most of these places in the Mediterranean have a very long history of human settlement. This is true also even for continental Europe, right? Leave aside the full urbanization that the Romans fundamentally accomplished in the West, as we were saying before, because cities did not exist. But it's not like there wasn't anything, or that there were just huts or whatever. Everything points to the further interconnection of this system. Unlike in the West, however, where cities and villages are distinct, the essence of Levantine history revolves around its cities. In fact, this is debatable to an extent. There are different degrees of urbanization in the West as well. For example, Italy is overwhelmingly urbanized. Southern Gaul is. Southern Spain is. Africa is. So in these places, there isn't, especially in Italy, much of a distinction between, at least a disconnection between the village and the city. If you go further north, you realize, I don't know, in northern Gaul, in the German provinces, along the Danube, it's another story, right? Even there, it's different from place to place. But at large, of course, there is a more modest level of urbanization. Cities, big centers are more scattered. Also during the Middle Ages, there's a world of the forest in countries like France or Germany that in Italy, for example, did not exist because everybody mostly revolved around cities. what I would say about the Levant in particular, also about the broader Hellenistic world, is that cities had managed to achieve a fundamentally hegemonic role in the domination of the land, right? In a seigneurial fashion. I mean, cities in the West, the Roman colonies, etc., were meant to control the surroundings, the countryside, but at large they emerged as cornerstones of a broader system that, as we've seen, stemmed from a fundamental principle of equality. In fact, the Roman these were centers mostly stemming from Roman colonization, which meant mostly Roman legionaries. They were all full Roman citizens. They were installed in very sort of identical ways. There was no favoritism between a legionary or another, at least whether there was or not. Like, they were in theory like all equals in front of a Roman law. And so also the pattern of settlement reflects this egalitarianism. In the East, it's different. In the East, you have very powerful seigneurial rule carried out by the city, right? That played an essential administrative, economic, and religious role. This is incredibly relevant. Imagine, in fact, these peoples being habituated to live as subjects, not as citizens. This is another radical distinction we're not even discussing fully today because it's big, right? But, for example, in the Roman cities, there is paradoxically much more corporatism. Why? Because that fabric of, say, substantially endowed and individual citizens in terms of, in fact, liberty, personal liberty, and power, is mirrored in the greater sense of associationism, or the fact that they are Roman, that they have a shared background, that they feel really that they can change this world, that they are ruling there. That's also how Romance came to be the prevalent language in many ways. This is a bit how it happened for Greek in the East, even though Greek was not, say, was the prevalent language at large, but again, in every local place there was the local language as well. So it functioned in a similar way. That's how similar these European civilizations had managed to transfer to by installing this identity of theirs in these countries that were of another ethnic background. That's how also later, for example, in late antiquity and in the Middle Ages, Western cities would be more politically autonomous and active compared to the Eastern ones. We often seen it in medieval warfare content, for example. Think about the urban militias, the communal armies, and so on. It also stems from a further sort of development in the political institutional picture that is different from the East, that in part does stick until the 11th century, as you know, to some sort of that initial statal model that had been a bit also Roman in that regard, especially from late antiquity, and thus more like from a Byzantine, a more Eastern background rather than a Western one. In the East, instead, you have a very strong elites. Like, it's not like you don't have them in the West as well, but in the East they are, let's say, in relation to the local populace, stronger. The Western elites are more powerful in general because they are they are really in charge as nobiliar clans. That's also why, for example, Constantine will create another senate in Constantinople and would make it of people that were not particularly powerful. The Roman Senate had much more powerful senators, and that's why Constantine had to go over to Constantinople rather than sort of reforming the senatorial, say, the Roman Senate itself, also for other reasons. But those are not to be belittled, like saying, Rome did not matter. Wait a minute, do you realize what still like the centrality of the Italian peninsula was in that context later on? There is, again, this catastrophism, this decadentism, that does not really help you understanding what are the absolute power relations involved here. So that the East actually has historically just a more autocratic reality in loco. It had always been the case. The same Macedonian, the Diadochoi kingdoms had indulge into that, like they would have never ruled Egypt or Syria like they would have ruled Macedon. The same goes for the Romans. Augustus would have himself represented as a pharaoh in Egypt on a regular basis. In Rome, he would have not even allowed another Roman citizen to kneel in front of him because he would have not been Roman. And also in his eminently sort of aristocratically Indo-European sense of himself, knew to be part of a chosen people that could not kneel to anyone, right? Things would gradually change, but that influence, for example, the proskynesis, it was already an Alexandrian one, and apparently was first seen in Domitian's reign as well. It would become also a hallmark of Byzantine court rituals, was of Eastern origin in many ways, Persian one, from already quite a time. Like they tell you, well, this is influence of the West during Roman times, of the East during Roman times. Yeah, in part, especially when the Constantinople was around, like to be the new capital, at least in that eastern part, in administratively speaking. So Rome was always the capital, always, right? Couldn't be different. It was the holiest city in the world. But it existed, like this proskynesis thing, from, since Achaemenid times, and through the same Alexandrian practice, also with the Hellenistic kingdom. So it wasn't just there for some, this Easternness came out of nowhere, and it had always been there, and the Romans had prevaricated it, had conquered it, had installed themselves there, had begun to rule there. This is, again, incredibly important. When you look at these cities, by the way, they varied in origin as well. This is interesting and important. City is also a generic term. We should digress into that, and surely we will talk about this part. Of course, an Hellenic polis was something different, a former Phoenician city as well, a great Hellenistic capital, maybe the one like Alexandria, that also was connected to like a poderous statal system in the Egyptian hinterland that existed since millennia, was another thing. There are the towns, think about the cave towns of Cappadocia. There is a number of different settlement types other than just the city per se, or the citadels, etc. So, as you know, the landscape is quite varied. You have the fertile crescent, you have the Mashrek, you have, in fact, coastal areas and different climatic zones. Some places are pretty darn cold, others are practically desert. So this is a very interesting way of declining to all of this in practice. So there was a mix between an indigenous tradition, so to say, while other centers embraced Hellenistic urban design and culture. Some of these centers have undergone, by the way, periods of both relative and complete decline already. Right? The Roman conquest does correspond to the fall of other empires. Think about the Seleucid one, for instance, the Ptolemaic regime that we have described already. I made a video about the Roman province of Egypt, how it had been constructed, also about Cyrenaica, Crete. Excuse me, I drink a little. These were failed states, essentially. Egypt had basically destroyed itself, buried itself in depth. So there weren't actually this explosion of fluidity in a, say, sense of orderly, government as we understand. There is a great difference between this, for example, in Rome. Right? Rome was, in that sense, much more orderly in many ways. These countries were more messed up to a degree. That's why they lose their sovereignty. A brief example, out of the 53 urban settlements known in Boeotia, so we're talking Greece, Hellas proper, so one of the most important centers of antiquity, not as developed as Attica or Peloponnese, but by Hellenic standards, but by, say, European, Mediterranean standards, very developed. Of 53 urban settlements there during the classical period, 10 had vanished by the end of the Republican era. It's not like the Romans had been particularly gentle, by the way, with the Greeks. As you know, Corinth had been razed to the ground. And that had been a major shock. Like, it sent out there major shock waves to the entire Hellenistic world, showing that the master race had arrived and that it didn't take a blip, like as initially the Romans walked, of course, in the east into Alexander's footsteps, and which footsteps, of course, just by that sheer subjection of the subject. The entire point was that, like, these centers subjected themselves to the Magus just out of the recognition of his divine nature that Augustus fully believed in. He believed, of course, that Alexander was not dead. He was alive, according to the traditional sense of the survival of the soul. I made a video about that in last All Saints days, holidays. But while the peace and stability instilled by the empire did not halt this decline entirely, and of course certain cities were rejuvenated, this was a different time from, say, classical Greece, just to remain in Boeotia. Like, if you see the peak of that, even just the Macedons themselves had subjected Greece at a point. And so this is not the 5th century BC anymore, it's 700 years later. And it's a completely different picture where most of these people had truly lost their independence, and they have done so, by the way, changing again their political and institutional profile, especially in places like Hellas that were founded on the polis. Whereas we've seen also for some videos about the later Hellenic military organization, of course, everything had tendentially gone oligarchic, right? We celebrate Greece for that alleged democratic and sort of republican system that was actually much more traditional than it was. But definitely there had been an age of tyranny in Greece before the Persian wars, also imitating, in fact, the eastern city-states, that the polis per se is some kind of product of, in hindsight. But there had been a phase of new oligarchization that the Romans had in part fostered by essentially giving power to more people, like to administer, to less people to administrate better certain areas that were exhausted anyway, so it wasn't much of a problem. And these people had contributed to the affirmation of the Roman establishment there too. Beginning in the time of Augustus, these cities sought to honor the emperor, for example, through monumental constructions motivated by both genuine interest and ambition, hoping to gain advantages that would elevate them above their competitors. This was true, for example, in establishing a hierarchy of cities as well. There was some sort of, for example, provincial capital emerging, right? Formally, as you know, these polis especially were very jealous of their independence. They would have, technically in this system, again, without the nation state as we know it from the 19th century, there wasn't such a thing like a new uniformation of cities. Every city was a different expression of a human power in front of the divine one, and so everything was different. Every place, I also talked about the traditional meaning of space. There wasn't such a thing like, even though it's very Hellenic, like in this case, to say like that there are, the Greeks developed this idea of categories, and so something that goes beyond the mere say instantiation of the individual being in terms of individual merit, which is in fact a bit of a modern secular way of seeing things. Still at the time they were incredibly self-aware about these differences, and also for eminently political reasons they would compete for becoming the place that would become essentially the provincial assembly that would also have to communicate the Roman governors and say also imperial power as a consequence, whatever, by of course highly enriching the city that had this role, right? And this entailed, of course, a completely different dynamic from whatever had ever been seen. Of course, there had always been some polis more or less ruling over others, but within the framework of this much bigger Roman system, it was a completely different story. Also consider that the polis as such had failed, you can argue, against Rome. Properly think about the speech of Philip V, or actually Perseus of Macedon, to the citizens of Pella, the issue of the citizenship, right? The fact that the Romans could field so many troops, apparently, like they said, because they could extend the citizenship, but it was a different way of seeing the world, really. It was a different way of contributing, as we've seen, as different peoples. Manumissions, a set of italic and cultural features that the Greeks had never had, because they considered themselves, again, inwardly and mostly in a conservative, protectionistic, isolationistic fashion. And so that even if the Iaudocoid kingdoms had de facto done what the Romans were about to do in a more advanced way in controlling this polis, there was no way to fully sort of pressure these Hellenic cities into some kind of enlargement of their territorial political commitment, also military, territorial, etc., for a purpose that they didn't consider the one unitly connected to the city. It's a very municipalistic way of thinking that did not help exactly the compaction of a broader power that was able to mobilize, and in part because, again, the polis is not the countryside, right? The Romans gave citizenship to communities that were much larger than that, that were even beyond individual cities, and so it was all a much bigger system at play. Not even the Iaudocoid fully managed to do so. They created military colonies, which were a different story, and they also had a lot of landed, country dimension for that. Otherwise, there would have not been a phalanx to begin with. So that's the difference between the Hellenic and the Macedonian world within the broader Hellenic one. That's also why, of course, the Macedonian one was successful within the same. It became clear that in light of the many populous polis, for example, Alexandria had more than 1 million residents at the time of Augustus, according to Strabo, though the actual count was close to 600,000. Antioch was home to around 300,000 people, and several cities in Asia Minor had populations exceeding 50,000, surpassing the capital of the three Gauls as well. This gives you a dimension of how central the city really was, how, in fact, there wasn't much of a bigger level of urban concentration around these very centers, if not coastally. The Romans were sort of spreading more uniformly their urban population in a almost more strategic and mostly military, in fact, colonial sense. These big cities could instead were nothing but big cities, right? Their previous system to leverage power from the local surroundings in terms of military organization competing with the Roman, what was not there anymore. That's why they were part of the empire. They had delegated that to the Romans. So these cities were mostly great florid trade centers, and they would contribute to a superior administration, would take care of the major aspects. Hence, as we were saying before, the subsumption of other polities that were initially some client states that were subsumed by probably the imperial government administration. So as far, especially as the military, because at the end of the day, this whole political it revolved around the sustainability of the Roman army, right? And therefore the protection that these populations had accepted to derive just to get from Rome, right? That seemed like the most obviously peace, order, civilization oriented master that it could ever find. Again, they were exhausted in terms of individual civilization. They didn't have that power to do it on their own. If it wasn't the Romans, it would have been the Parthians. In any case, yes, some sort of other regional power could have emerged, mostly on a provincial basis, but without much chances to simply survive. It had already happened during Hellenism at the end of the day. There had been a decline in Hellenism. We talked about this from a military point of view. And essentially Rome took over. All the various, we think about Pontus, Armenia, the remains of the Seleucids, Egypt, Pergamon, Macedon, the Hellenics. That's exactly how it had happened. So that's how Rome could afford to have the upper hand. Sometimes you hear, I don't know, some strange materialistic, deterministic explanations why this happened. It's evidently about moral force. It's evidently about politics, right? These cities, as you understand, are really impressive, and they yet are sort of much more reliable than other more active European provincial centers that evidently had not been sort of exhausted yet historically. We're talking about continental Europe, we're talking about the capacity, again, of certain even very intensely Romanized places to just maintain their own distinct identity, just also based on the pretty solid fundamentals that had been created. I mean, arguably the greatest success of Rome, aside from Italy as a whole, the Roman-Italic Confederacy, was Gaul. Right, Gaul really embodies this, as you know, with the empire, so-called Empire of the Gauls in the 3rd century, even a very interesting, say, role prefiguring the Catholic centrality of the West in as far as the Merovingian, the Frankish world was concerned, together with Rome later on, in saying we are on our own as far as our own administration is concerned, but we are fully into the Catholic idea of the empire. We want to remain within it. We don't work to destroy it, like instead, I don't know, the Palmyrene were trying to do. Right, the Palmyreans in that sense are very interesting. They're a bit the exception in the game, but remember they were backed by the Parthians, and in spite of sort of because there were rebellions in this system, right, the East was crossed at different times by important uprisings, not just the Jewish ones, but it's also because these systems were relatively passive to this external influence. Palmyra was a bit different place. It had some it was very civilized to an extent, but it had also tribal background. I mean, in the interland, it was a bit of a frontier dimension that could have a bit that aggressivism, as we were pointing out, but it was also tendentially a bit outside of the, not much of the empire. Also, territorially speaking, it doesn't render much the idea, but at its fringe, right, at its frontier at least, and being especially productive, because as we were saying before, this is a good example of why such centers would emerge from literal oases in the midst of nowhere. Caravans, international trade, the so-called Silk Route, even though that's a term mostly applicable to the Middle Ages, which still existed there. That's why they're also more ambitious, like peoples from outside the frontier, right? Now, these populous cities took pride, of course, in their illustrious histories that frequently gave rise to feelings of superiority and which were eager to gain the favor of the imperial authorities while safeguarding their privileges, yet essentially being no threat, right? This is one of the interesting aspects of civilization, that when you manage to create a system whereby the internal competition is fundamentally about concurring to the official posts of civil administration, thus contributing to the system, you have a very strong public power. You have a very strong stability, you have a very strong pacification, and so even though the systems never remain the same, they can perpetuate themselves for a consistent amount of time to further sediment other achievements. And in fact, this is at large what also these centers remain, with a few exceptions. Of course, I don't know, Alexandria would not be as important in the later, I think it's Middle Ages, like Cairo, right? This is true also for other, I don't know, think about Cairo. These were new cities founded in different times where the balance had shifted in many ways, or the situation was more fluid. But if you pick Jerusalem, if you pick Antioch, if you pick, again, the major, also in the Byzantine world, that what they managed to retain, sort of the major centers at large reflected this once, except especially within the Byzantine Empire, you see that we've seen it very often during the Middle Ages. There is a dramatic shrinking of urbanization. Essentially, all these great cities of the past become towns. and is somehow disappointing. Other, again, the aforementioned Antioch, Jerusalem, they were somewhere else. They had a different role. They, again, had their centrality, because in part they had escaped the Byzantine world. They had also ended up orbiting more decentralized areas that had in part fostered their autonomy further, but never, even in that case, anything comparable to the Western centers. By the way, consider that at the end of antiquity, the biggest centers of the empire actually laid in the West. This is not, but say, if you pick, aside from Rome, of course, but Verona or Milan or other, there are lots of different centers that compare even to what had been relatively less important cities. For example, Aphrodisias, by the time of Justinian, was one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean. But it's not like Aphrodisias had ever been the capital of an empire, and still it wasn't huge in other terms, nor it would be later. So you should always be careful in comparisons, because nothing is particularly obvious. You can argue that the West preserved its cities better than the East on the longer run, at least if you pick properly the medieval kind of standard. And if anything, starting from late antiquity, the vector, the migration era, say better, the vector of further development. In the West, cities would remain a much more important cornerstone for political and territorial domination. In the East, things would be a bit more degraded and complicated. Rome could not implement, of course, a policy in the East akin to which it embraced in the West. As a result, the third reason for advancements of the second century is that Rome formulated a strategy tailored for the East, which was kind of obvious. And you see, it had come along the way. More details are necessary to elucidate the characteristics of this policy. It seems to have presented itself in two interconnected forms. Firstly, within the provincial structure set up by Rome, there was a genuine, or at least superficial, acknowledgement of the existing institutions that bolstered the Roman authority. These centers realized that they were part of an empire. They paid tribute to that. They contributed, again, with their means, with their resources, with their people, to the imperial administration, to the army. This is what made the system work at large. Secondly, there was the promotion of a city model that was modified to fit local conditions and circumstances for more effective dissemination. As we were saying before, the Romans did not colonize the East as much as they did with the West, and the West was much more difficult to conquer compared to the East, at least to conquer and to create ex novo, like as a civilization. The East was in this sense simpler. So it's not like these cities had put up a greater resistance. You had to be aware of them, because the mob was dangerous. Nobody really had the full means to control, again, the moral majority. These places without the moral majority of the population, look at the Jewish revolts. Those were pretty big, serious things, right? And just because the Jews really set up their mind against Rome. That's quite reflective also of other dynamics across the empire. Naturally, Rome was quite careful also in the East, because these were in fact important cities, and so there was a proportionate care. But it's not like there was much of otherwise a military resistance to Rome, as you know. These places were mostly taken over with arms, but say just mostly with Rome acting as the obvious master, having already manipulated these countries for a very long time before fully taking them over. A notable and extreme illustration of the first approach, by the way, can be seen in Egypt. Aside from a few high-ranking officials, attacks known as decapitation, which affected everyone except Hellenics and Romans aged 14 to 60, a change in land status, and the founding of the Hellenic city of Antinopolis under Hadrian, there were no significant changes compared to the Ptolemaic period. I made a video about Augustus' arrangement of the Egyptian province that, as you know, was quite peculiar. And you understand here what happens. Essentially, the Romans perpetuate what had existed before. There is an overwhelming majority of native Egyptians that are basically spent. They do not even have a significant organization on their own to politically oppose to whomever. It's essentially the Romans and the Greeks that rule, making them exempt as, in this sense, aristocratic noblemen. This European background saying, we are the conquerors. Here the Romans were equating, essentially at this point, themselves to the Greeks in terms of that lack of taxation, because a true freeman is not taxed, right? Or at least it is contributing to a very different degree, just primarily conceptually as a warrior, right? Consider that the Hellenic citizens here are not Roman citizens, right? So the Romans were at the top, but still the elite was constituted by these European settlers that at times existed by now, like from centuries, even half of a millennium, and that distinguished themselves from the rest of the natives. Just think of how colonial and positively colonial this is. I mean, how successful this establishment really is. For a country like this that literally does not need any other system to effectively work. In the area of Aura, we're talking southern Syria, where Rome could not depend on a network of cities, because it was, in fact, that less urbanized interland we were talking about before, but where numerous rural communities managed their affairs relatively well, influenced by the pastoral ways of, say, the Arabian desert is just next to that, and there are caravans, there is a way to organize oneself. Rome encouraged these villages to adopt more organized institutions and granted the most prominent among them the privileged designation of metrokomia, which in Hellenic means mother village. Part of this was done to further stabilize and settle these communities as a protective belt against the nomads. This was some sort of micromanaging. You have the Roman legions that, of course, do not allow any of those mother blippers to sort of come without, say, with impunity into civilized lands. And the Romans did have, did carry out some expedition here and there. There was a military activity on the frontier, as always. But it was important, of course, to create protective layers so that you would. It's just how Rome had absorbed this outer policy. Just imagine it, even in a. I don't know. It makes you feel secure yourself, like, except that this calls a bit more of costs and gradual exhaustion, in fact, of the local communities in their efforts as well. But you really want to stabilize the system as much as you can. This is the classical world. It's a poor world. It's a fragile world. It's a delicate world. Even if it's Rome at her peak and whatever, this is still a very delicate system. And you don't want to waste anything. Also, the local communities would have sort of wanted to be helped, would have accepted this. They would have had a dialogue at large with the authorities regarding what was the best. Another significant point is that the number of free and even self-governing cities, such as Laodicea in Syria during Hadrian's reign, was much greater in the east than in the west. Right? There was as we were saying before, since Alexandrian times, a much greater sense of, okay, you can do whatever you want, because in part you're polis, in part just we are so powerful that we don't even need as rulers to question every single thing you do. Also because we feel secure that you're not really going too far by yourself. And the Romans were fine with that. Consider this, again, the Roman Empire, truly in a European perspective, dominating this surrounding world. Like, we, again, like to always highlight the sense of mixing of different peoples blended, a pan-Mediterranean. That was none of that, right? This was a European empire coming to rule over other peoples pretty directly, and maintaining, as we've seen, this distinction quite heavily. And in a way that, in a sense, from Rome, from the West, generally, it did not seem like a big deal. If some place got raided in this, yes, it was a problem because, as we've seen, resources were wasted. But there were so many bigger problems at large happening that who cares if some of those Levantines actually die, right? We don't care too much. It was, again, a much greater sense of the superior value of the race of the conquerors, of the Westerners, and it's not like much has changed even today. We evaluate things in, of course, for what the reality really is, and in an earthly dimension. And even though Rome, of course, had an evangelic, Catholic, ecumenic power that would help the same people's developing, there was still a very rigid, heavy, and patriarchal divide between the rulers and the subjects. The subjects, which, as we've seen in the Levant, are essentially subjects. As for the second aspect of the Roman policy in the East, several examples can be cited. In Patras, Greece, for instance, the Roman colony in the city was established through synocism by Hellenic inhabitants. That is to say, essentially they had merged both Romans and Greeks. While further north, Nicopolis, one of the many Nicopolis, this was the one founded by Octavian after the Battle of Actium, in fact not as a colony, but you see in his imperial powers as an Hellenic polis. The Romans would found themselves Hellenic polis. It was an obsequium to the East. Not as such, but to Alexander's legacy. Remember, Octavian was the guy that, when crushing the last Hellenistic power, goes to Alexandria and contemplates Alexander's corpse in his coffin, in his tomb, and he thinks that he's alive, right? The followers say that let's go now to visit. That was a nice tour of Alexandria, visiting tombs and dead people. But in fact, this person was not dead. In fact, Octavian's answer, because they told him, let's go look Ptolemy's tomb, and Octavian answered, I'm here to visit the living, not the dead. And Alexander was alive. In another area, inland Anatolia, savage place, all right, it's pretty rough, composed by mountaineer communities, tribal groups formed a new city, let's say town, to a degree, because there is a very specificity in the term civitas, right? Also as far as polis in Greek, but these were also something different that, yes, were provided with a formal status through, in fact, this bigger civilizations sort of models, but there were so many different settlements organized by these interland peoples that were towns, citadels, oppida, fortifications of some sort. Anatolian areas that initially retained their status as priestly states even transition into standard polis in the 1st century. We're talking about, for example, Hierapolis in Phrygia if you prefer. I made a video about those places. In Pisidia, veterans from Augustan military colonies soon assimilated into the local environment. A similar situation occurred in the Bekaa, today's Lebanon, where native communities and Roman colonial settlements, which included a Pagus Augustus, so an Augustan village, existed in a state of deep symbiosis. Right, this is quite fascinating because it shows even how at a very local level, even in villages, there was a sense of humanity embraced, not just by the local military, say Roman colonists, or legionnaires provided with, or citizens that in general provided with these new lands, but also like by the subjects that in a sense were also passively living this to a degree, but that eventually would end up, of course, mixing with the conquerors, which would bring, in fact, many advantages. Consider this: if you have the Roman citizens arriving, of course, you may have harsh feelings towards them or whatever, but it's not like you're going to lose too much out of it as a community. In fact, that would be protected as Roman. That's also how, in part, the Romanization occurred. There is a final aspect also that enriches our understanding of the Levantine development in the 2nd century. That is the imperial attitude towards these communities. Following the last, the civil war of the Second Triumvirate, with Mark Antony, Augustus concentrated on remedying the damages caused by the wars and restoring relations with Hellas and the Hellenistic East. This was obvious given the fact that, as you know, Antony had been consistently backed by that world. Egypt had provided him with astronomical ciphers. That also why Cleopatra was always next, because she had actually great control, as we've seen, as a Macedon, on Egypt at large, and they had really a great sense of their monarchic self, even for a queen, even though she was never fully there were only male rulers, of course. Traditionally, she was ruling on behalf of other relatives. And we made some videos, by the way, about Antony in the East, his Parthian campaigns that had been part, in fact, of that effort to essentially perpetuate Alexander's image. Not much because Antony was a degenerate Philo-Hellene at all, right? Antony was deeply Caesarian, whereas Octavian had stepped further in the truly Augustan dimension. Just he had to rule what he had, and so he had to second the local establishment as well. That's a very delicate time in history. We'll have to come back on it, but you know what I'm talking about. Now, Augustus' focus was partly motivated by the speed with which Eastern cities hailed his victory and fostered the imperial cult, as evidenced by the early sanctuaries dedicated to Rome and Augustus in Nicomedia and Pergamum, that had witnessed this clash of titans and were quite historically predisposed to hail, of course, this or that ruler that would display such magnificent power. Of course, what Augustus does is so straightforwardly divine, as we have explained countless times in Catholic tradition, that there is really no doubt, especially after Actium, who's the winner and who has gotten the empire. It's unprecedented. Not even Alexander had ever had so much wealth in his hands, how much power extended on so firmly and permanently, on so many peoples, like Augustus had at this point. That's why, and this stemmed, in fact, not from mere, equilibrium, but for all the reforms and governance and control that he enacted, as well as a consequence, as an imperium whole, as a medium of God himself. We made multiple videos about the Augustan era, and we'll keep doing that, of course. Augustus' concern for the eastern provinces, which included support for Corinth, the earthquake striking Paphos in Cyprus, and Athens, was complemented by displays of loyalty and enthusiasm, such as temples and name changes for cities. This dual approach continued and expanded throughout the 1st century. For instance, Claudius took a special interest in Apamea, which was renamed Claudia Apamea in his honor, and in 77 Corinth, devastated by an earthquake, received abundant gifts from Vespasian, prompting the city to rename itself Colonia Julia Flavia Augusta Corinthiensis. As you understand here, the Greeks are privileged in a way. They are, again, already by themselves the master race in the Levant, and they are actually, for this reason in part, showing their devotion in the moments of crisis, right, that will not make them abandon completely, especially at this point, their Hellenic identity. But from a political point of view, you do know that these cities will somehow, they will remain Greek, they will keep speaking Greek, and there is nothing to do about it. This will never change. But they will, across the centuries, know themselves, call themselves as Romans, as Romaioi. Hence, they will deal with the Romanity of the Byzantine Empire. That was truly ingrained in this sense. And it would be interesting to follow the whole path, because we know, I think, also, not a few really, but surely these topics have been extensively studied, but it's important to see it as a continuity, but also as a change. We've witnessed also in the West, at some point during the migration era, everybody's a German. Why? These were Romance people. This trend, of course, might seem like mere flattery. In fact, that adulatory attitude had been contemporarily, observed by the Romans regarding these Eastern peoples that were to be considered subjects. Remember, the Romans here are the conquerors, the vanquishers of these very people. So they are, in the sense, the protectors now of the, not of quite the inertness, because still these cities had, for example, their militias, etc. But definitely, this can quite be the superbi once again. Just a bit of a Virgilian citation, as you know. But the point is quite relevant. You can see this in the architectural reorganization of the urban center, which began to feature buildings associated with the imperial cult. In part, these were spontaneous organizations, where again these oligarchs paying for that. We have a temple dedicated to Augustus, we know, as far as Malabar, on the western Indian coast, where there were Roman merchants. But in this sense, like, how distant is really Rome? How far-reaching actually the empire is? So the East was increasingly experiencing a level of Romanization was transcending mere ethnic competition as it had been up to the conquest, but now was delving into the hierarchical, metaphysical dimension of the within, which is always fascinating, because again, from Romanity we get so much in civilizational terms, but remember, it's also a bit the moment in which you gentrify a bit too much, in which you relax. In fact, you do not grow particularly more active overall. The same Greece historically would be subordinated Constantinople in a way that had lost basically its relevance. It's not like Byzantium was just it was a relevant polis, but as you know, had not played this enormous regional power role before. So just think of how things change. Consequently, after a century of groundwork, the prosperity of the eastern part of the empire likely stood on more robust foundations than those of the western part, if we can consider at least this progressed systems of organization predating the Roman practice of government. I have enormous doubts regarding the fact that the East was simply, say, stronger, right? It would have not survived without the empire as a whole, as an independent entity. That's the reason why it was under Rome, and why this activities was being pursued. So the notion that it was stronger, it's mostly like a socio-economical, and even maybe just economical preconception. Surely this is true in terms of governability, of political and institutional control from those who want and can't connect these areas. This is also very complicated, because we should talk more about the Parthians to fully understand how also the metus hostilis towards that people brought the coastal dimension of the East to prefer Rome, right? This is something we've seen also in other times in history, like the Levant is different from the Middle East, right? It's very separated. It's another culture. It's affected by other forces. There is also a very important level of building program developing, as we've seen, connected with the imperial establishment that has a lot to do with that concentration of resources in the hands of fewer rich people that control the communities. There's a swift pace of building occurring, leading to impressive structures, by the way, occasionally with devastating repercussions. If you look at, for example, the theater in Nicaea, now that was destroyed by an earthquake, was rebuilt by Pliny, by the way. And so you understand this kind of governmental interest and investment also in upkeeping, maintaining this infrastructure. It was at large, like in the Roman Empire, a public but private endeavor at the same time, right? The local governors funded these initiatives to provide their communities with greater prestige, to really flag Rome that they were there. The motivations of these invaders, of course, are not for this reason just economical. There is a mix of reasons. Aesthetic. It's also in part like useful practice, like sanitary infrastructure. Think about aqueducts, like it's baths, but it's so necessary. Prestige, just per se. But this is all about, at the end of the day, the political preeminence of these centers and the ones of their elites in the broader system empire. For example, the presence of an emperor is quite relevant. At some point, the rulers do visit these places, and the better they are, the more the emperor wants to go there. Athens to Gerasa in Jordan, Ephesus to Pergamum. These are, as you know, Hadrian's stops. Hadrian visited the entire empire, also the frontier, but not only. And he was very much like an Hellenistic, Philo-Hellene emperor. There were generous donations from extraordinarily wealthy individuals as well. Herodes Atticus in Athens and Corinth, Vedius Antoninus in Ephesus, Agrippa in Palmyra. Nicomedia and Nicaea were fighting against one another, Prusa, Apamea as well. We talked about this in the video about Pontus and Bithynia, and it's clear when you realize what kind of also administrative centrality the individual city really had for the administration of the province. That entailed also the capacity, in fact, to get more wealth and to build a stronger city that would sort of be ever more protected just by the general eventualities. At some point, I don't know, you have the Sarmatians, the Alans, ravaging Asia Minor. Having strong, robust city walls, being a bigger center, so for the empire to mind about its defense, it's relevant, it's crucial. It's crucial for investment, it's crucial for the general labor force that you can squeeze out of it, just of this demic concentration. This, as we've seen, were big cities. The biggest cities were, again, rare, and Rome is the biggest city of all, but overall the picture is the one of also more modest settlements that reflect this stratification. There are natural disasters at times, earthquakes that are connected also with the idea of God that punishes but allows within this regeneratingly evangelical empire the chance of redemption, a chance of rising from the ashes as stronger than before, this cathartic process. And the variety of buildings, as we've seen, is very wide. We see, first of all, the imitation of Roman architecture that was, as you know, very specific, becomes much more pronounced during the 2nd century. This includes the thermae, the triumphal arches, the amphitheaters, sewage systems, aqueducts, covered marketplaces. It's not like these things did not exist before, especially in the Hellenistic world. But how many do you actually know them before Roman times? Like, Rome made all much bigger and especially perfected the Hellenistic achievements in science, technology, engineering, etc., and added much on their own for different reasons down we don't digress on, but it was a very specific Roman style in all this. By the way, Rome truly blossomed herself in this kind of period in a infrastructurally wise, right? It was the moment in which like the greatest acumen of Roman engineering and pragmatism in many ways was displayed in order to rule an empire, and given it such extraordinary foundations that last to this very day, which include, of course, also a tendency toward monumental grandeur. This is observable in vast colonnaded streets, the preference for colossal buildings. This is, think about Rhodes Colossus, right? This already existed it was very appreciated by the Hellenistic mindset. Think about the Demetrius Poliorcetes, think about the great, the monster war machines, warships, etc. of the Hellenistic world. The heads of this, the intelligentsia of this world, wanted to really show Rome that they were still essentially at her same, almost at her same level, and that they could also leverage some power in the process. There is an harmonious yet mixed artistic style that exhibits thus from Hellenistic, Roman, and local traditions in various measures. You can see it in Ephesus, Aizanoi, Baalbek. There are all kinds of... some of these cities will be actually renamed, as you know, in more Roman ways, right? But there is a wide variety of temples of probably of different reaches that you can't quite contemplate, if not through a detailed map of the complexity of these territories. These are all different places, all different cultures. By the way, the western coast of Asia Minor is by far the most overwhelmingly urbanized, rich, affluent part of this world, right? There is a lot in Greece too, etc., but the extent by which that area gains also stability, likely due to the fact that it had remained always part of a frontier before. And so this is liberated. And by the way, Pergamon had backed Rome. There is the Rhodians, as we were mentioning them, held out for for a long time. There is an interland, as we've seen. There is a more Canaan background down southeast. So these are all different places that have all slightly different styles, but also pretty divergent ones, depending on also the kind of system of building and reason for it. One point that is crucial in this, as I was saying before, is that even though we still see today the magnificent relics of such Romano-Hellenistic past, we shouldn't necessarily think that these cities, specifically cities, were particularly, say, enjoying a particularly, or let's say better, a proportional amount of economic development in parallel, right? Much of this could have been the way some of these cities squeezed out sort of a lot of wealth just to compete for primacy. And this tells you in part, of course, how not self-reliant they were, how much Rome, again, had been important for their development. In fact, while some areas merely managed to survive, such as Boeotia and eastern Anatolia, the overall impression is one of unmistakable wealth marked by agricultural, artisan, industrial, and commercial richness that, however, was really invested, was really spent, was really taken by the empire, was reinvested for sure, as we've seen in much more straightforwardly local fashion. We see a lot of Syrian activity, also, as we were saying before, because they control these places were at the end of the Silk Route. They opened to the Mediterranean from there. And so they had the natural predisposition for that endeavor, right? In the past, there had been more important. Lebanon was more important. The Phoenicians, the Syrians. Now this is their day, as you know. In Rome, there was a general complaint of this presence as well, considering this Levantine intrusion almost in an ethno-cultural sense. These were considered like freedmen, third estate, or people that did not, other than just not being Roman, they bore in fact some sort of negative stigma, almost some racial inferiority in Roman view. There is plenty of instances of this, and such a discrimination could be ferocious. But the Syrians would be active for a long time. Actually, Syria was one of the areas that consolidated the most more political physiognomy in this part of Roman history, especially the 2nd, 3rd century. Then basically just Antioch maintained that centrality, also Laodicea, etc. These have been, as you know, important centers of the Seleucid Empire, and they were quite strategic, like between Anatolia and the Levant, the Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean. They really they were also relatively easy to defend because of certain geographical features and this greater accessibility from the sea itself. Consider that Europe also in the Middle Ages would keep having these contacts in their same places. So especially from Italy, which tells you a lot about the continuity of this historical connection that really started mostly since Roman times. Like in previous years, it wasn't that straightforward. Syrians excelled in both small and extensive trade networks across the empire. This is not just about Italy and the Levant. This is finding Syrian merchants in Gades, in Cologne, Colonia Agrippina, Ostia, of course, Lyon. In fact, also as for the late antique and early medieval history is concerned, we have documented this, especially in the videos about the Jewry that also did come through these channels. Rome had an old Jewish community from quite a long time, centuries before Christ. But in fact, also these important international centers, even in Central Europe, already witnessed the presence of such Syrian agents, merchants. We're talking about powerful people, by the way, at least within the realm of that mercantile third estaters reach. Like considering that this was the peak of Roman interconnection, yeah, they had an important role. There's a funerary inscription from a merchant in Laodicea claiming that he was to deliver, quote, to the Celts and the Western territories everything that God has ordained to be brought from the eastern land, abundant in every product. This is incredibly fascinating. You see here the Celts that can be even, I don't know, the ones living outside of the empire still. But these traffics existed, we know it too well, we're actually acknowledging that, of course, given the limits in documentation, there was a much greater level of and a much longer ranging reach of these expeditions and more. Also, the long-distance commerce between Rome and India or China was de facto controlled by Levantines. Or consider, of course, that there were Roman citizens that controlled some of these people, that owned them, serfs as freedmen, as slaves. And the first centers that you have to observe, the caravans are, passing through, as we've seen, Petra, Palmyra, in part also Alexandria, but mostly from, that in Egypt, the thing that matters is the Red Sea access, as well, also to circumnavigate the Parthians, the Asian hinterland. There was an actual Suez Strait built in Hellenistic times. It was something quite interesting, but we'll talk about this another time. Controlling these accesses was quite fruitful. There were the contacts also with the Horn of Africa and beyond, but in any case, the eastern part was just more exposed to those contacts to the rest of Eurasia. the westernmost part was just enshrined by in the east by the Levant itself. During the latter half of the Antonine period, the East shines brightly in the Mediterranean sphere across various facets of intellectual life as well. There is an intelligentsia, there is a culture, there is an elite, there is an oligarchy. We have Philo of Byblos, to Phoenicia, Plutarch of Chaeronea, Hellas, Arrian of Nicomedia, and Bithynia, Appian of Alexandria, in Egypt, along with the traveler Pausanias. So these are all Greeks, right? So they are also part of the broader Roman world. They know Latin, they understand, of course, the ever more important role that Latin literature has, but they are still very Hellenic-minded as far as the referentiality to their world. It's as if this was an Hellenistic world within a broader Roman world, and as such, it was so big, right, that they just enjoyed that lifestyle that they had had. We will surely talk about these figures at some point individually. We often cited many of them. Think about Arrian. We're talking about the Alans before for our military historical videos. Now, in rhetoric, prominent individuals exist as well. You need that kind of political discussion, but also flattery, tendentially in these places connected to courts that now the Romans fundamentally have there. Herodes, Atticus, Dio of Prusa, Aelius, Aristides, some of these authors are really capable of expressing the greatness of Romanity. As far as this fool Aristides especially, making one of the most beautiful hymns to Romanization, to the greatness of the empire, right? Lucian of Samosata in the Anatolian hinterland as well. All people from distinguished backgrounds that could and would represent politically their communities and put their talent and skill and education at the service of Rome. Maximus of Tyre. Contributions to medicine are epocally made at this point by Galen. With his treatises, astronomy is represented by Ptolemy, that we discussed the other day profusely when talking about just the world geography, ethnography as well, and a bit about the ancient Germans. In literature, we see the novel written by Longus of Lesbos or Philostratus of Athens that are from the cream of the Hellenic world, probably. This is the heart of it, in sort of the enshrined in the Hellenistic one, enshrined in the Roman one. So they are all prevalently at least figures from the eastern half of the empire. At this point in history, you start having also a very interesting grafting of legal studies in, let's say, of some empire-wide prominence in the East, because up to this point the Romans had dictated rules. Now the empire is Romanizing, so other centers other than the Latin West are developing their institutions. For example, the School of Law of Beirut is the most important center in the East. We have seen it in the videos about Justinian. These were such important centers that would remain almost contemplatively connected with their prestige of the school. For example, like think about that time, the following century would witness the Arab conquest, right? So they seem such distant times, instead they're so close to one another, because in part these centers had fundamentally specialized in that and serving that broader function that when the empire shrank could not be sustained, at least in political military terms, just with juridical skills. When Trajan requires an architect, he turns to a Syrian named Apollodorus of Damascus. And practically all the great infrastructures and buildings, including the Pantheon, are the merit of the singular individual. There are great infrastructure being built. Think about the port of Ostia under Trajan. We're looking at moments of enormous expansion of infrastructural work, of gigantic one. And the Hellenistic giantism definitely helps. These are people who work in the imperial entourage, so they build stuff across the empire to make the empire bigger. These are big, large-scale infrastructure. They're not just local buildings. They are something that serves the entire interconnection of the empire. In the 1st century, some Hellenic speakers maintained a disdain for the Western barbarians. Hellenic culture was straightforwardly xenophobic and would not really change over time. In fact, behind this more obvious subservience to Rome, many of them lingered on to their memories of their former greatness that, however, now they almost cognitively dissonantly denied. It was also typically Hellenic. By the 2nd century, this attitude had, of course, changed, because now, of course, while there was an attachment to the old city and their prestige, like if you lived in Athens, in a Rhodes, in a Pergamon, like of course you would feel that very much also in political and historical terms. But there is a greater sense of ecumenic Catholic identity, belonging to the Orbis Romanus. The Roman world was much more important than any other identity. It was just at this point understood that that's what Romanity was about. Consider that the term Romania for the land of the Romans, also in the eastern part of the empire, especially in the Balkans, in Greece, was expressed in the 3rd century, so we're not far away. The lecturer Aedus Aristides that we mentioned before made this beautiful praise of Rome, asserting among the various things that there are no longer merely Latinate Romans and Hellenic-speaking Romans. Right? Is this simply a rhetorical flourish? Not really, because these languages, at least these cultures, were mixing to an important degree. And you know that the Roman administration would maintain Latin as the official language of the empire in the East until the 7th century. All right, so it's not like in Greece people ever spoke Latin by majority or anything. It was sort of a cosmopolite world to a degree, especially the elites, right? Mostly the countryside remained what it was historically everywhere. So that's why there is a bit also through this Hellenistic ecumenic rhetoric, the sense that everything is more or less the same. It's also a bit of a, probably the Romans, the Roman Italics did not reason this way at all. They had a much haughtier and self-aware sense that they had the upper hand. But unfortunately for them, the Hellenistic works were the most produced, the most read. The Romans were a warlike people. They did not really need to self-represent themselves in a literary fashion. It was considered sort of emasculated to at least the extent the Greeks would normally make, like in the circumstances. But it is true that at a higher level, this, in fact, Roman identity kicked in the East as well. That tells you also how sort of iron-fisted the Roman rule really was. I mean, in the West, as we've seen, people would speak Romance languages. In the East, not. At least not in the lower Danube, fundamentally. However, they will adopt and maintain Latin as the official language of the empire until a time in which the Latin parts of the empire were fundamentally lost and beyond. So this tells you how the Greeks had partially interiorized the fact, at least, that they were Roman, at least in the same way they were Greek, which is naturally a problem that the Westerners did not have until at least the Germans arrived. It was similar. But in fact, Latin was prevalent there too, so it's another story. Like, the Romance world was, in fact, the one that represented the finest achievement of Rome in a deeper sense. And as such, Romanity would prevail with Latin and all. It was, in fact, able throughout all the Middle Ages and later also the modern age, plus with Italian during the Renaissance to be the language of Europe in those years. So it's really at this immensely scaled level of cultural impact. You find, as you know, a mini copy of Rome everywhere, right? I always make the example of Algeria, some places that are very small, even as cities, but they all have their own curia, their own baths, their own temple to Jupiter. We know that certain Syrian villages had built thermae, and over 350 sites related to gladiatorial games and hunting have been identified in the Hellenic Eastern world, which is not too much, meaning that at least there weren't as many as in the West, and of course we're also of a different type. Today I will not explain why, in fact, this aspect of Romanity did not spread. In fact, this is the point. These people weren't really Roman in the way we understand Romano-Italic identity in that sense. At a higher social level, Claudius Pompeianus, a general in the service of Marcus Aurelius, was the son of a Milas from Antioch. And so you start, this is again part of a greater integration also of the Italic elements. There are also, of course, lots of citizens at this point that were really ethnic locals. In 193, at an advanced age and nearly blind, determined to retreat from public life, Pompeianus was approached with a proposition for power, which he declined. And this offer is interesting because it's set against an earlier usurpation by another Syrian, Avidius Cassius, carrying significant symbolic weight. The idea of an emperor being of Eastern origin at this point is not longer far-fetched. And in fact, with the end of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd, much will change in that direction. You know, that will be even so-called Arab, at least one Arab emperor. There would be reasons for this, and it's not like, say, those were some of the peaks of the crisis in many ways, reflecting this randomness as well. But the fact that now the empire will, that as you know, will not be fundamentally an Eastern thing. Like, the elites were quite mobile, but at large there is a Western centrality in the empire that remains unspoiled. As a consequence, it's important to look at the 2nd century as this moment of transition, like any other, because that's how things happen, and you know, they never stay idle. It's an interesting juncture because you see that the supreme power of the empire, already with some features of transformation that really leave space to the fact that the previous identities to Roman conquest were never really skated to a radical degree in this land, like in others as well. It's not like, by, for example, speaking Romance, the goals were, I don't know, forgetting their own identity or their own legacy, etc. There is much of that as well, right? What you have to understand there also is especially the layers of power. Who is in charge? Why is a language prominent or not? Why would a country go under this change as opposed to another, like in another province? These are all issues that are not sort of easy to answer, if not by looking at, again, the relative histories that are going to probably be part of our videos. At some point we will resume, as we were saying in the beginning, the provincial Roman provinces series fundamentally. This is crucial because we forget how large the empire also was. I mean, how successful in this sense it really was. Right? It's not merely a matter of let's say, some monolithic system that wouldn't work, that would just sit there and do or be nothing, worth remembering just for being, I don't know, for falling at a point. No, it's an order that you must admire in its in the fact that it may have not really existed if it hadn't been for this organic function it had within our hierarchy and fundamentally a divine Catholic order. This is crucial. It's difficult in a sense to picture without other references of particular sort, mostly as you see through the conventional way Roman history is told still, at least the Vulgata with which people have been bombarded ever since they have accessed the internet. Now they got tired of, except they have remained impressed with that, and now they're replicating the same, spreading it far and wide whenever unfortunately they stop sort of talking about history. But now that's not good, but at least there is maybe a chance to restart with something more concrete, with videos like these and with very particularly different view of the empire that was known for a long time, and that we find ourselves here just to rediscover without any let's say surprise, at least to have forgotten this history that it makes so much more sense this way, and it's much more interesting in fact in this sense. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.